For over a century, the Macedonian Phalanx was more than just an army. It was an unyielding law of physics. 20,000 pikes created a wall of iron so dense that no Roman could even see the face of the adversary he was meant to overcome. It was a machine of absolute order, a shimmering forest of bronze moving with the terrifying certainty of a landslide. To face it was to face a monolith that seemed beyond human frailty, a system where victory was a matter of crushing arithmetic. But at Pydna, the earth itself staged a quiet, geometric rebellion. As the phalanx crossed jagged limestone, the uneven ground pried microscopic cracks into the line, gaps just wide enough for a Roman shortsword to slide through. In a heartbeat, the longest spears in history became useless wooden anchors, trapping their owners in a paralyzed forest where they could no longer even turn to face those who came to dismantle them. This is the story of how the legacy of Alexander the Great was strategically unmade, proving that absolute invincibility is merely a fragile illusion waiting for a single stumble on a rocky hill. 168 years before the birth of Christ, the plains of Pydna did not look like a theater of engagement. They looked like a mathematical error in the architecture of the world. Across the heat-hazed horizon, 20,000 Macedonian sarissas rose into the humid air, creating a forest of seasoned ash and iron that defied the very concept of nature. This was not a gathering of men, but a singular, shimmering organism made of bronze and 21-foot spears, a relic of Alexander's ambition that had not known a true master for over a century. To the Roman legions standing on the opposing ridges, the sight was a physical impossibility, a wall of points so dense and perfectly aligned that the air itself seemed to struggle to pass between the ranks. There was no shouting, no clatter of equipment, and no nervous laughter from the veterans of a dozen campaigns. There was only the heavy, oppressive weight of a machine that believed it was the final word in the history of human struggle, a monolith of order waiting for the signal to replace the messy, undisciplined reality of the West. The sun hung low and ominous, catching the edges of the bronze shields until the entire Macedonian line became a mirror of gold. From a distance, the phalanx appeared to be a solid, immovable object, a geological feature rather than a tactical unit. As the first rhythmic thud of 10,000 sandals began to vibrate through the earth, a strange and subtle wrongness began to manifest. The ground beneath the Macedonian feet was a deceptive tapestry of hidden limestone ridges and shallow, jagged gullies that the scouts had dismissed as insignificant. As the great ironclad glacier began its descent, the earth started to demand a tax that the rigid geometry of the phalanx was never designed to pay. A man in the third rank would adjust his stride by a fraction of an inch to avoid a loose stone, and that movement would ripple backward through the files like a shutter in a suspended bridge. It was a silent, microscopic failure of logic. To the Macedonian officers, the line still looked perfect, but to the Roman consul, watching from his horse, the invincible forest was beginning to breathe in a way that signaled a terminal malfunction. Small, jagged fractures were prying themselves open in the fabric of the bronze wall, tiny tears in the order that the frantic, whispered commands of the centurions could not stitch back together. The momentum was too great, the mass too heavy, and the terrain too honest for the lie of perfection to hold. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and the dry, metallic scent of heated iron. But the tension was no longer about the coming encounter. It was about the realization that the system had already broken before a single blade had been drawn, a realization that sat like a stone in the stomachs of the men who felt the ranks opening beneath them. They were marching into the gaps of their own history, unaware that the ground they stepped upon had already chosen its outcome. The rhythmic cadence that should have been their strength was now a countdown, each step widening the invisible wounds in the formation. The silence of the Roman line was no longer one of apprehension, but of a watcher observing a colossal clockwork beast slowly grind its own gears into dust. The inevitability of the failure was written in the dust kicked up by 1,000 stumbling feet, a slow-motion unraveling of a century of military pride, unfolding in the quiet, humid air of an afternoon that refused to end. The logic of the Phalanx was not born of passion, but of a cold, geometric certainty that had dictated the fate of empires for over 150 years. It was a doctrine of absolute negation, predicated on the belief that the individual was a liability, who could only be redeemed through total integration into a machine. To the Macedonian mind, the theater of engagement was not a place for individual contests or the fluid chaos of maneuvering, but a grid to be occupied by a force that rendered the adversary's movements irrelevant. The primary instrument of this philosophy was the sarissa, a 21-foot pike of seasoned ash that transformed the rank and file from a singular unit into a structural component. When the first 5 ranks leveled their reach, they created a thicket of iron points so dense that no one, no matter how resolute or well-armored, could bridge the distance to respond. It was a masterpiece of physics, a system designed to solve the problem of confrontation through the simple application of reach and mass. This confidence was reinforced by a century of unbroken tradition, a legacy inherited from the conquerors of the known world. Every man in the ranks understood that his endurance was not dependent on his own skill with an implement, but on his ability to remain a shadow of the person in front of him. The training was a relentless exercise in synchronization, a ritual of movement where thousands of bodies learned to breathe, step, and pivot as a single, multi-limbed organism. In the silence of the pre-engagement maneuvers, the only sound was the rhythmic creaking of leather and the low metallic hum of the pikes vibrating in the wind. This was the comfort of the machine, the knowledge that as long as the formation held, the world was a stable and predictable place. The Phalanx did not need to be faster or more clever than its counterpart. It only needed to be more consistent. It was a mountain of bronze that moved with the slow, overwhelming inevitability of a tide, confident that anything in its path would eventually be overcome by the sheer weight of its advance. To the Macedonian officers watching the Roman legions on the ridges, the opposition looked less like a structured force and more like a collection of disparate individuals. The Roman style of engagement, with its flexible units and reliance on the short blade, seemed like a regression into a primitive and disorganized past. The Macedonians viewed the Roman checkerboard formation as a sign of weakness, an admission that they lacked the discipline to maintain a truly solid front. From the perspective of a veteran sarissa bearer, the Roman combatant was a tragic figure, equipped with a tool that required him to get dangerously close to the opposing rank. The logic of the Phalanx dictated that the Romans would never even reach the first rank of shields. They would be caught on the points of the third and fourth, meeting their end in a vacuum of space where their courage had no target. This was the arrogance of the system, the belief that order was a universal constant that would always prevail over the untidy, frantic energy of a less structured foe. As the descent toward the plain began, the feeling inside the ranks was one of supreme, almost meditative control. The men felt the strength of their neighbors' shoulders pressing against their own, a physical reassurance that the wall was intact. They marched with the cadence of a clockwork mechanism, their eyes fixed on the backs of the helmets ahead, trusting the geometry of the formation to guide them. The officers moved along the flanks, their voices calm and measured, adjusting the angle of the pikes with the precision of architects. There was no sense that the ground beneath them could be a participant in the encounter. To the Phalanx, the earth was merely a stage, a flat and passive surface upon which they would execute their inevitable outcome. They did not see the limestone ridges or the shallow gullies as obstacles, but as minor irregularities that the momentum of 20,000 men would simply flatten. It was a moment of perfect, daunting clarity, where the logic of the machine felt as unshakable as the stars, unaware that the very rigidity they worshipped was the flaw that would turn their advancement into a final enclosure. The descent into the valley was supposed to be a triumph of gravity and geometry. But as the Macedonian phalanx crossed the invisible threshold, where the gentle slope turned into a series of jagged, limestone-studded terraces, the machine began to fight itself. The sarissa, once the ultimate symbol of reach and power, now became a 21-foot lever of instability. Every time a man in the rear ranks stepped onto a loose stone or slid into a shallow depression, the tip of his pike, nearly 7 meters ahead, would sway in a wide, uncontrolled arc. This swaying was not isolated. It rippled through the files, the heavy ash shafts clattering against one another with a sound like a forest breaking in a gale. To the men in the center of the formation, the sensation was one of sudden, inexplicable seasickness. The solid ground they had trusted for a century was proving to be a traitor, and the rigid discipline that had fused them into a single organism was now the very thing transmitting chaos from one body to the next. This was the first stutter, a momentary lapse in the hypnotic rhythm of the march that should have been a piercing alarm to the commanders on the wings. Instead, it was interpreted as a minor, inevitable friction of the terrain. The officers, their eyes fixed on the distant Roman lines, shouted for the men to close the files, believing that the gaps were merely temporary pockets of air that would be squeezed out once the formation reached the flatter ground of the plain. They did not see the microscopic fractures for what they truly were, the beginning of a terminal structural failure. The logic of the phalanx did not allow for the concept of flexibility. It was a system built on the assumption of a perfect surface, and in the absence of that perfection, it had no protocol for recovery. The officers' commands were not tactical adjustments, but desperate attempts to maintain a facade of order that the geography of Pydna was methodically stripping away. Inside the ranks, the atmosphere shifted from the cold confidence of the morning to a state of focused, sweating anxiety. A soldier in the fourth rank found himself drifting an inch to the left to avoid a jagged route, and in doing so, he bumped the shield of the man beside him. On a parade ground, this would have been a shameful error. Here, it was a physical necessity that created a chain reaction of stumbling. As the men struggled to maintain their footing, the once impenetrable wall of bronze began to stretch and warp. The gaps were small at first, but as the descent continued, they began to pulse with a rhythmic, unsettling life of their own. This was the breathing of the phalanx, a slow expansion and contraction of the line that looked, from a distance, like the heaving of an expiring creature. The soldiers felt the air rushing into the spaces where their neighbors' shoulders should have been, a sudden and unwelcome exposure that made the skin on their necks prickle with an ancient, instinctive apprehension. The Roman consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, watched this transformation from his vantage point on the higher ground, his silence a sharp contrast to the frantic activity of the Macedonian officers. He did not order a charge. He simply waited, watching the invincible forest stutter and sway. He saw the gaps opening like gasping mouths in the heat of the afternoon, revealing the soft, vulnerable interiors of the units. To his experienced eye, the Macedonian formation was no longer an army. It was a series of disconnected islands of iron, held together by nothing more than the momentum of their own descent. The Romans on the ridges began to notice the change as well, their initial hesitation replaced by a calculating curiosity. They saw the Macedonian line stop being a wall and start being a collection of individuals struggling with their own equipment, their long spears becoming horizontal anchors that hindered their movement more than they protected their position. Despite these warnings, the Macedonian advance did not falter. The weight of the rear ranks, thousands of men who could see nothing but the helmets in front of them, continued to push the front lines forward into the valley. This was the momentum of a landslide, a force that could not be stopped even as it tore itself apart. The officers continued to ignore the widening fractures, telling themselves that the sheer mass of the phalanx would compensate for any local irregularities. They viewed the breathing of the line as a manageable byproduct of the terrain, a minor distortion that would be corrected at the moment of impact. They were so blinded by the history of their own success that they could not recognize the sound of their own undoing. The clattering of the pikes grew louder, the gaps grew wider, and the air grew hotter. Yet the machine ground on, convinced of its own unshakable status, even as the earth beneath its feet continued to pry the bronze plates of its protection apart. The silence that had defined the early morning was now replaced by a chaotic, discordant symphony of wood on wood and the frantic, heavy breathing of 20,000 men. The heat of the sun reflected off the bronze shields created a shimmering haze that distorted the vision of the soldiers, making the Roman lines seem to dance and dissolve in the distance. This sensory overload further masked the reality of the situation. The men felt the instability, but they could not see the scale of it. They trusted the system because the system was all they had ever known, unaware that the very rigidity they worshipped was preventing them from seeing the enclosure they were building for themselves. Every step forward was a commitment to a geometry that no longer existed, a desperate gamble that the world would eventually conform to the shape of their formation. As the phalanx reached the lower slopes, the breathing became a violent, irregular shudder. The gaps were no longer microscopic. They were jagged tears in the fabric of the line, some wide enough to fit a man. The Macedonian officers, realizing at last that the situation was slipping beyond their control, began to call for the files to lock shields. But the commands were drowned out by the roar of the descent. The machine was now moving faster than its own logic could follow, a runaway engine of bronze and ash that was unraveling from the inside out. The Roman consul raised his hand, a small and quiet gesture that signaled the end of the wait. He had seen the failure, he had measured the gaps, and he understood that the time for observation was over. The phalanx was still moving forward, still looking like a mountain of iron, but it was a mountain made of sand, waiting for the first gust of wind to turn it into a memory. The final warning came in the form of a sudden, jarring halt in the center of the line. A section of the phalanx had hit a particularly deep gully, causing the front rank to stumble and the rear ranks to pile into them. For a few seconds, the invincible machine simply stopped, a stutter in the heart of the formation that sent a shockwave of confusion from one end of the line to the other. The pikes tangled, the shields clattered, and for the first time, the Macedonian soldiers looked at one another with eyes full of a raw, unvarnished doubt. They looked for the order that would save them, for the maneuver that would restore the wall, but there was only the sound of the wind and the sight of the Romans beginning to move down from the ridges. The facade of control was still there, a thin and brittle layer of tradition, but beneath it, the realization was starting to take hold. The machine was broken, and they were the only ones who hadn't been told. The moment of contact was not the thunderous encounter the Macedonian officers had envisioned, but an unsettling, silent entanglement. As the front ranks of the phalanx reached the Roman line, the nature of the air itself seemed to thicken, turning from the dry heat of the afternoon into a viscous, airless pressure. The Roman units did not attempt to meet the wall of pikes with a countercharge. Instead, they began to dissolve into the shadows of the 21-foot spears. They moved with a daunting, fluid grace, sliding into the jagged fissures created by the uneven ground, bypassing the iron points that were designed to engage at a distance of 5 ranks. For the Macedonian pikemen, the disorientation was instantaneous and absolute. Their implements, the heavy ash sarissas that had been the tools of their ancestors' glory, were suddenly transformed into cumbersome, horizontal anchors. A tool that requires 10 feet of clearance to be effective is a terminal liability when the adversary is standing 6 inches from your chest, his presence felt against your face, and his short, heavy iron already searching for the openings in your linen protection. The system was still functioning according to its ancient rules, but the rules had become an enclosure. The rear ranks of the phalanx, thousands of men who could see nothing but the bronze helmets and swaying pikes of the men in front of them, continued to do exactly what they had been trained to do for a century. They pushed. They leaned their weight into the backs of their comrades, providing the hydraulic pressure that was supposed to drive the phalanx through any resistance. But there was no longer a resistance to push against, only a void filled with Roman iron. This forward momentum, once the machine's greatest strength, now became the mechanism of its systemic failure. The front ranks were pinned between the relentless weight of their own army and the surgical precision of the Roman gladius. There was no room to withdraw, no room to drop the pikes that were now tangled like a forest of dead wood, and no room to utilize the short irons that hung uselessly at their sides. They were a calcified stratum of bronze and flesh, paralyzed by the very order they had believed would protect them. The sensory landscape of the engagement shifted from the grand scale of maneuvering armies to the suffocating intimacy of an industrial disassembly. The sound was no longer the rhythmic thud of marching feet, but the wet, repetitive thud of iron meeting physical resistance, and the frantic, shallow gasps of men realizing they were entombed in open air. The long sarissas, crossed and locked together by the frantic movements of the expiring, created a canopy of ash that blocked out the sun, casting the interior of the formation into a strange, flickering twilight. Inside this cage of wood, the temperature spiked to levels that defied endurance. The heat generated by thousands of exerting bodies, trapped under the August sun and insulated by layers of bronze and quilted linen, recycled itself until the air became a dense soup of sweat, dust, and the metallic tang of copper. Men began to collapse not from physical breaches, but from the sheer impossibility of drawing a breath against the crushing weight of the crowd. The Romans moved through this paralysis like mercury, their short irons working with the grim economy of harvest laborers. They did not need to parry or feint. The Macedonian wall facing them was a statue in iron, armed but unable to respond, waiting for the finality to reach it. A Roman would slide past a pike, step into the gap, and deliver a single upward thrust under the rim of a shield or into the exposed neckline of a person who could not even raise his arm to deflect the gesture. The individual Macedonian was erased by the weight of the collective, his discipline transformed into a fatal paradox. If he broke rank, he might endure, but a century of drilling made the thought of breaking rank more daunting than the iron itself. He stood his ground because the system commanded it, even as the system was feeding him into the mechanism. It was a mass surrender of agency, a moment where the machine had become so perfect that it no longer required the endurance of its components to maintain its form. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the phalanx had ceased to be a tactical entity and had become a geological feature of the plain. The ground beneath the sandals was no longer earth, but a slurry of broken wood and the fallen, a topography of ruin that the survivors had to navigate just to continue the struggle. The pikes that had once pointed proudly toward the heavens were now a shattered ruin, pointing in every direction like the quills of a broken beast. The psychological dam had not yet broken, but the physical limits of the formation had been exceeded in every possible dimension. They were no longer engaged in a struggle. They were merely occupying space, providing the friction that kept the enclosure tight. They were the reserve of a collapse, a singular organism that had forgotten how to breathe, its extremities being sheared away while its heart felt the mounting pressure of its own vitality. The realization was finally starting to ripple backward through the ranks, a cold wave of understanding that moved faster than any officer's command. The arrogance of the morning had vanished, replaced by a heavy, airless dread that sat in the lungs like silt. The officers on the wings, who had spent the last hour calling for the files to close, had fallen silent, their voices lost in the muffled roar of the compression. They watched as the Roman units, once seen as primitive and disorganized, proved to be the more advanced specialists, their flexibility allowing them to thrive in the very chaos that was suffocating the phalanx. The logic of the machine had been defeated by the logic of the short iron, and the point of no return had been passed without a single signal to mark it. The air grew hotter, the press of bodies tighter, and the silence of the Roman line more daunting. The system was still holding, its bronze shields still reflecting the fading light, but it was the holding of a shell in a suit of armor, standing upright only because there was no room left to fall. The Macedonian organism did not reach its end with a cry of distress. It concluded with the sound of 1,000 joints locking in a final, airless stasis. By the middle of the afternoon, the Phalanx had ceased to be a structured formation and had become a geological anomaly of bronze and biological remains. A calcified stratum where the individual was erased by the crushing weight of a system that no longer knew how to stop. The discipline that had been the pride of the dynasty for over 100 years had transformed into a mechanism of systemic undoing. The soldiers in the front ranks were no longer in active engagement. They were merely the leading edge of a slow-motion unraveling, pinned against the Roman implements by the relentless, unthinking pressure of the 15,000 men behind them. These rear ranks, blinded by the dust and the towering canopy of their own pikes, continued to lean into the backs of their comrades, obeying the ancient command to push, unaware that every step forward was a heavy blow driving the front lines deeper into a Roman mechanism. The Roman gladius was no longer an instrument of engagement, but a tool of systematic removal. The units moved within the jagged fractures of the line with a daunting rhythmic economy, their irons finding the soft gaps in the Macedonian linen protection with surgical precision. There was no room for the grand gestures of traditional encounter, no space for the sweeping arcs of a long iron, or the desperate parry of a shield. The space had become so compressed that the finality of the situation was the only movement left to the Macedonian pikeman. A soldier would feel the sudden, cold intrusion of iron into the vulnerable openings of his neckline or chest, and find that he could not even raise his arms to protect his face, his elbows pinned to his ribs by the sheer density of the crowd. He would fall, but the ground was no longer a solid surface. It had become a slurry of copper-scented mire and shattered ashwood, a place that swallowed the living and the fallen alike. When a man's legs finally gave out, he did not hit the earth. He was held upright by the press of bodies, an upright, inert figure whose weight added to the suffocating burden of the men on either side. The 21-foot sarissas, once the unshakable reaches of a superpower, were now the primary instruments of the formation's immobility. Tangled together in a chaotic web of seasoned wood, they created a horizontal cage that prevented any man from turning to face the specialists inside the gaps. To drop the pike was impossible, as the shafts were locked by the pressure of the files. To use them was a fantasy, as the adversary was already past the perimeter, working with the grim patience of laborers. The system had reached its terminal velocity, a state where the rules of the Phalanx were being followed to the letter. Yet every rule was now a terminal decree. The requirement to hold the line meant that the men stayed in place to be removed. The requirement to maintain the push meant that they pressed the vitality out of their own front ranks. It was a mass surrender of the spirit to the logic of a broken machine, a moment where the collective will of 20,000 men was being used to facilitate their own erasure from the record. The auditory landscape of the theater of engagement had distilled into a muffled, rhythmic thudding, a sound that grew louder as the layers of the ranks were peeled away from the periphery. This was the sound of the Roman advance, not a charge, but a systematic collection. The heat inside the pocket had reached a level of overwhelming intensity, a wet and heavy pressure that caused the lungs to ache with every shallow, desperate gasp. The smell of copper and salt was so thick it could be tasted, a sensory blanket that smothered the instinct for endurance. Men who had spent their lives training for the glory of the empire now found themselves reduced to structural components in a failing architecture, their identities erased by the bronze plates that bound them together. They were no longer the vanguard of the East. They were the friction that kept the enclosure tight, the fuel for a process that had already consumed their future. As the sun began to cast long, distorted shadows across the plains of Pydna, the psychological dam finally disintegrated, leaving only the mechanical reality of the dismantling. There were no more orders to give, because there was no longer an army to receive them, only a singular, failing organism that continued to twitch with the involuntary spasms of the unfortunate. The officers who had ignored the warnings of the morning were now silent, their voices lost in the grinding roar of the compression. They watched as the Roman units, moving with the fluid precision of Mercury, methodically cleared the gaps, turning the once unshakable forest of pikes into an expanse of broken timber. The realization had finally reached the very back of the formation, but it brought no relief, only a cold and paralyzing apprehension. The men in the rear ranks finally stopped pushing, but the weight of the fallen and the momentum of the failure carried them forward anyway. A silent procession that could not halt until the last person had been accounted for. The ground, once the stage for the most sophisticated military system in the world, was now a topography of ruin, a raised plateau of inert remains that stretched for miles. The Roman work continued with the repetitive, dead-eyed rhythm of manual labor, the flash of the iron appearing and disappearing in the twilight like the stroke of a clock. The system of the Phalanx, designed to dominate through order and mass, had achieved its final, perfect form, a solid block of humanity so disciplined that it allowed itself to be erased one person at a time, without ever breaking rank. It was a triumph of physics over resolve, a demonstration that a machine, once broken, becomes the most efficient, final enclosure for its own creators. The air grew cold, the wind began to howl over the site, and the silence of the void began to fill the space where an empire used to be, leaving only the mechanical sound of the strike and the final wet gasp of a world that had forgotten how to breathe. The sun finally retreated below the horizon, leaving the plains of Pydna in a gray, monochrome light that revealed the absolute scale of the erasure. The sounds of the struggle had ceased hours ago, replaced by a silence so profound and heavy that it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums of the few who remained. The wind, which had carried the heat and dust of the encounter, now blew cold and indifferent over a landscape that had been terraformed by a single hour of surgical precision. The plain was no longer a stretch of Macedonian farmland. It was a raised plateau of biological remnants and shattered ashwood, a topography of ruin where the floor was composed of 20,000 figures who had believed they were part of an unbreakable machine. The forest of sarissas, those 21-foot symbols of a century of dominance, lay scattered across the mud like the bleached ribs of a prehistoric leviathan, pointing at a sky that no longer recognized the empire of Alexander. The survivors did not weep, for weeping requires a sense of self that had been removed from them in the press. They stood among the cooling bronze in the marked earth with a hollow, wide-eyed shock, their minds unable to process the speed at which their reality had been deleted. They stared at their hands, at the broken wood, and at the long, straight Roman roads that seemed to stretch toward a future they would never inhabit. The king had fled into the darkness, the treasury was gone, and the Phalanx, the ironclad legacy that had defined their civilization, was now nothing more than a heap of scrap metal and rotting linen. The era of the spear had not concluded with a noble offering or a grand heroic engagement. It had been terminated by the mechanical efficiency of a short iron in the hands of a farmer, a tool that had found the gaps in their pride and turned their own rigidity into a final enclosure. The Roman victors did not cheer. They moved through the twilight like ghosts, their arms swollen and trembling from the repetitive motion of the disassembly, their minds numbed by the industrial scale of their own success. They wandered the field with torches, not as specialists but as ghastly custodians of a sepulchre they had built with their own hands, looking for loot in a sea of faces that all wore the same expression of final, stifling apprehension. They stepped tentatively upon an expanse of the fallen because there was no bare ground left to walk on, their sandals crunching on the shards of broken pikes. The looting was not an act of greed, but a grim census of a concluded world. As they stripped the bronze from the stiffening forms, they uncovered the true story of the final minutes. Individuals who had met their end without a single physical breach, overcome by the weight of their own comrades, and veterans who had clenched their jaws so hard in the intensity of the weight that their teeth had shattered. The magnitude of the silence solidified the event into a permanent scar on the history of the world. There were no messengers riding to Pella to report a setback, for there was no one left to report the truth. The 20,000 figures who had marched out with the rhythmic thud of confident seekers were now just texture on the landscape, providing for the scavengers that were already gathering in the shadows of the hills. The Macedonian state would be dismantled, its cities partitioned, and its name eventually relegated to the footnotes of Roman triumph. But the world that existed before this sunrise was gone forever. The confidence, the belief in the simple arithmetic of superior reach, the arrogant faith that a rigid order could always prevail over the untidy reality of the earth, all of it lay buried in the mud of Pydna. The engagement was over, the machine was scrap, and the only thing that remained was the daunting truth that an entire era can be ended, not by a long and winding struggle, but by a single afternoon where a once invincible system stumbles upon a rocky hill and forgets how to breathe.